Kansas City. January 1967. The Chiefs' locker room smelled like liniment and certainty. These men believed something. Not casually, not as a talking point for press conferences. In their bones, AFL football was better than NFL football. Faster, more creative, more dangerous. And on January 15th, they were going to prove it in front of the entire world. They had beaten the Buffalo Bills for the AFL championship. They were ready. They were confident. They were wrong. But they didn't know that yet. And across the field, in a locker room that smelled exactly the same, Vince Lombardi was sitting in a chair staring at nothing. Not nervous, not excited, thinking. The way Lombardi always thought before games. Quietly, completely, leaving nothing unexamined. He had been preparing for this moment for 15 years. And before this story can make sense, you need to understand what those 15 years actually cost him. Vince Lombardi spent the first 4 decades of his life being told he wasn't ready, wasn't right, wasn't the right fit. He coached high school in New Jersey for 8 years, while other men with lesser minds got the jobs he applied for. He watched from the sidelines of professional football, while coordinators who couldn't diagram half his plays got head coaching opportunities. He was too intense, too demanding, too Italian, too everything that the comfortable men who ran professional football in the 1950s didn't want disrupting their arrangements. He heard it all, absorbed it all, and kept working, because the alternative to working was accepting that they were right. And Lombardi would never accept that. In 1954, the Giants finally gave him a chance. Offensive coordinator. Not a head coach job, not what he wanted, but a door. He walked through it, and immediately made the Giants' offense one of the most feared units in football. He waited for the promotion. It didn't come. He kept waiting. It still didn't come. In 1959, Green Bay called. The worst team in the NFL. 1 win the previous season. A franchise so broken that serious coaches had turned the job down. Lombardi said yes before they finished the sentence. What Lombardi built in Green Bay between 1959 and 1966 was not just a football dynasty. It was proof. Proof of everything he'd believed about himself during all those years of rejection. Proof that the men who'd passed him over had been not just wrong, but completely wrong. The Packers won the NFL championship in 1961. Again in 1962. Again in 1965. Again in 1966. 4 titles in 6 years. Lombardi had become not just a successful coach, but the definition of what a successful coach looked like. His name was used as a standard. His methods were studied. His phrases were quoted in boardrooms and military academies and locker rooms across the country. A man who couldn't get an interview in 1952 had become by 1966 the most influential figure in American football. And now one more thing remained. One argument still unresolved. One question that all those championships hadn't fully answered. Because the AFL existed, and the AFL had its own champions. And for 7 years, the 2 leagues had competed in parallel universes, never crossing paths, each claiming superiority, neither able to prove it. That argument was about to end. The American Football League was born in 1960. It was born out of rejection. A group of ownership groups that had tried and failed to get NFL franchises decided to start their own league. The NFL laughed, openly, called it a minor league, called it a vanity project, called it exactly what they assumed it was, a desperate imitation that would collapse within 3 years. It didn't collapse. It grew. It developed its own stars, its own style, its own identity. The AFL played faster, looser football. More passing, more innovation, more willingness to take risks that the conservative NFL establishment would never sanction. Young fans loved it. Television loved it. And the AFL players developed a specific pride that came from being dismissed and surviving anyway. By 1966, the AFL was not a joke. It was a genuine competing league with genuine talent and genuine belief in its own superiority. The 2 leagues agreed to merge, and as part of that merger, they agreed to play one game, one championship game, the best of each league, on a neutral field in January, to settle the argument once and for all. Lombardi understood the stakes better than anyone. This wasn't just a football game. This was a referendum on everything NFL football represented, on his football, on the power running and the precise execution and the physical dominance that he had spent his career perfecting and preaching. If the Chiefs won, if an AFL team beat the NFL champion, the argument wouldn't just continue. It would shift. The AFL's claims of superiority would have evidence behind them. Lombardi's entire philosophy would be questioned. And Lombardi, who had spent 15 years proving himself right, was not going to let that happen. He was 53 years old and standing on the largest stage professional football had ever created. He was going to win. He was going to win in a way that removed all ambiguity. He was going to make a statement that the scoreboard alone could not fully contain. The question was how, and the answer was simple. The answer was always the same. Execution. Perfect execution of things done perfectly in practice, until perfection became automatic. That was Lombardi's football. That was always Lombardi's football. The Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum held over 90,000 people. On January 15, 1967, only 61,000 showed up. The game had been announced on short notice. Tickets hadn't sold the way organizers hoped. The empty seats were visible from the field, a strange backdrop for what was supposed to be the most important game in professional football history. But the television audience was enormous. 50 million people watching in America, the largest audience for a football game to that point. Lombardi didn't care about the empty seats. He cared about the 50 million. He cared about the statement being made in living rooms across the country. He cared about what people would say the next morning. The Chiefs were not intimidated. They came out loose, confident, playing with the swagger of men who believed they belonged. Quarterback Len Dawson was calm. The AFL offense was precise. For the first half, the game was closer than Lombardi wanted. The Packers led 14-10 at halftime. Not dominant, not the statement, not enough. If you've ever watched a man decide that good isn't good enough, that winning isn't sufficient, that the margin of victory is its own message, subscribe right now. Because what happened in that second half was not just football. It was Lombardi making a point that would outlast the game itself. The halftime locker room was quiet. Lombardi spoke. He told his players something that his biographers would later quote and requote and analyze from every angle. He told them the Chiefs were a good football team, a real football team, but they were not as good as the best NFL teams. And the Packers were the best NFL team. And in the second half, they were going to play like it. No adjustments, no new strategy, just execution. The same plays executed better than the first half. The same principles applied with more precision, more force, more relentlessness. The second half began, and the Packers became something different. Not different in scheme, different in intensity. The execution that Lombardi demanded in practice, the standard that had never been acceptable below perfect, arrived fully in that second half. The offense moved with a rhythm that the Chiefs' defense couldn't disrupt. Bart Starr reading defenses before the snap, distributing the ball with the calm of a man doing something he had done 10,000 times in practice because he had done it 10,000 times in practice. The running game hitting gaps that the offensive line created, with the precision of men who had run these plays so many times that thinking about them was no longer necessary. When you don't have to think, you can just execute. And when you just execute at that level, defenses cannot stop you. The final score was 35-10. The gap that had been 4 points at halftime became 25 by the final whistle. The Chiefs, who had come in believing they belonged, left having learned something they hadn't known before. There was a level of execution above what they'd experienced. A standard they hadn't encountered. Not because the Packers were more talented at every position, but because they had been drilled by a man who accepted nothing less than perfect until perfect became instinctive. Lombardi walked off the field, and someone who was there said he looked less like a man who had just won the greatest game in professional football history and more like a man who had just finished a job he'd been planning to do for a long time. Satisfied. Completely. But not surprised. Because in Lombardi's mind, this outcome had never been in genuine doubt. The only question had been the margin. The press conference afterward became its own legend. Reporters crowded in. Everyone had questions. How does it feel to win the first Super Bowl? What does this mean for the NFL? What did you think of the AFL? Lombardi sat down, looked at the room, and said the sentence that would be quoted for decades. He said the Chiefs were a good football team, but they don't compare to the top teams in the NFL. That was it. No celebration, no extended analysis, no diplomatic softening of the conclusion. The AFL had claimed superiority for 7 years. Lombardi had just disproved it in 3 hours, and was stating the conclusion with the matter-of-factness of someone reading a weather report. The reporters wanted more. He gave them nothing more, because nothing more was necessary. The scoreboard was the argument. The press conference was the punctuation. What Lombardi understood in that moment, what made his response so perfectly calibrated, was that overreaction would have diminished the victory. Celebrating too loudly would have suggested the outcome had been uncertain. Treating the game as a landmark achievement would have implied the competition was at a level that required acknowledging. Lombardi refused to grant the AFL that status. He said they were good. He said they were not as good as the top NFL teams. He left the room, and in those 2 sentences, he accomplished something that 50 years of press releases and official statements couldn't have managed. He ended the argument, permanently, conclusively, without anger, without drama, without anything except the quiet certainty of a man who had never actually doubted the result. He won Super Bowl II the following year, against the Oakland Raiders, 33-14. Then he stepped down as head coach. Then he came back with Washington. Then the cancer came. He died in September 1970, and Green Bay retired his name and his number and his memory, the way cities retire things when they understand they will never see their like again. The Super Bowl trophy was named after him. Every January it gets handed to a winning coach who holds it up, and somewhere in that moment, whether they know it consciously or not, they are standing in the space that Lombardi defined. The standard he set in those years in Green Bay. The execution he demanded. The refusal to accept anything less than the best effort of the best prepared team. That is his legacy. Not the wins. The standard. The understanding that preparation is not a means to an end. Preparation is the point. Every rep in practice. Every correction on film. Every demand for one more perfect execution when the team thought they were finished. That was Lombardi building something that would outlast him. Something that would outlast all of them. Something that the Super Bowl trophy, named after him and raised every January, tries and fails to fully contain. Vince Lombardi stood in a press conference on January 15, 1967, and said the Chiefs were not as good as the top NFL teams. He said it without ceremony. He said it without looking up. He said it the way you state a fact you've known for a long time. And then he went back to the hotel and probably sat quietly, the way he always sat quietly after things ended, with the knowledge of a man who had spent 15 years being told he wasn't ready, wasn't right, wasn't enough, and had spent the next 8 years proving, in the most public and undeniable way possible, that the people who'd said those things had been wrong about everything. The argument was over. Lombardi had ended it, with a football game and 2 sentences. And that was enough. That was always enough.